Tony Woodcock's at loosehead up against Ben Franks. Both players end up getting into a good low position, but Woodcock wins the hit and dominates early, with Franks coming back, although he receives significant help from George Whitelock, who illegally slips up to push on Woodcock. Look at the initial body height of both players. Their hips are at the same height. Woodcock's got his feet slightly further back than Franks, but they're both nice and low and in a good position to engage. As they go into the engage, their hips don't lift up. They only move forward, which lowers their knees. At the point of engagement, Woodcock's knees are slightly behind his hips, and as a result, his knees are slightly lower than that of Franks. That gives him a slight advantage. You can also see that Woodcock has dropped his head to get it under Franks, and as we now look at what happens after the engagement, you can see that because of Woodcock's head being down, his body goes down, which pulls Franks down with him. Woodcock wins the hit, and as a result Franks is under pressure, which forces his hips up, so now Woodcock has a significant advantage. But now comes the hard part for Woodcock. He's got to have tremendous strength and technique to lift his upper body back up whilst driving forward. Of course, a secure bind is critical here, and with the tight jerseys these days, that's a real problem for looseheads. Franks is good enough to be able to recover his position and stay low enough to start offering some resistance. The Crusaders won that scrum, but Woodcock's technique was fantastic. Here Owen Franks is up against Sekope Kepu in 2011. Kepu's body height is poor, and this shows what happens with poor technique. Look at the initial body height of both players. Their hips are at the same height, but Kepu's body shape isn't as good as Franks. Franks is a little lower and in a really good position to engage. As Kepu moves into engage, he steps forward, which is really poor technique. He's now got no way to get his knees behind his hips so he can drive forward. The contrast between the height of both players at the point of engagement is vast. Kepu's hips have gone upwards, whereas Franks has moved his hips forward and down, which has lowered his knees to get into a good low position. The height of their knees shows how much lower Franks has got, and that gives him a huge advantage. Because Franks is that much lower than Kepu, he's dominating. That forces Kepu's hips upwards, and we can see that what he actually starts to do is have to take multiple steps back to try and recover. Once you're going backwards in a scrum, there's virtually no way to go forward again, and as a result, Kepu starts to buckle and hinges, which he's rightly penalised for. On which you build your scrum. As I've shown you previously, they've got to keep a good low body height so they get lower than their opposite prop, and this is achieved by keeping their hips down so they act as an effective conduit to transfer the power from the middle row straight through into the opposition. Before the pack's engaged, the middle row's shoulders should be onto the prop's hips, and as you can see in this illustration, if the prop's hips are too high, that'll bring the middle row up as well, and they won't be pushing flat straight through to the opposition. Let's have a look at an example of how this works. You can see here the Waratahs, the front row keep their hips down, which enables the middle rows to also stay down, and that means the whole pack is pushing at the same height and transferring all of the weight straight through to the opposition. And even as they drive through, they maintain the same body height, which means the whole pack is operating on one plane, directing all of the pressure through to the rebels. Let's take a look at another example of the Waratahs pack where they're not quite as effective. Upon engage, the pack is generally at the same height, pushing through, but Dennis is lower and pushing down, and Moen is a little higher and pushing up. As a result, they're not all working in a coordinated way, and they can't get the drive through their props into the rebels, and as a result, the rebels dominate the scrum. Here's another example, and we'll start by looking at the Wallabies. Whilst the pack is generally on a good horizontal driving plane, Elsom is so low that he's driving on Mafu's hamstring. Now, whilst it's important to be low and to be driving horizontal, it's also important to be driving at the same height. In this example, the Springboks are all over the place. Individual players are pushing at different heights and on different angles. They're certainly not working as an 8, and there's no way that they can transfer the force from the middle row through the props and into the Wallabies. As a result, it's the Wallabies that get on top in the scrum. As the scrum develops, you can see that Smith at hooker stands up with his legs almost vertical. That causes his hips to be well above the rest of the pack, and when you've got one of your front row in that position, you've got no chance to transfer power through. And from the World Cup final, here's a clip of the French pack not operating together. You can see the front row at one height, the middle row at another height, and actually angling down. And as a result, there's no way they can transfer power through to resist the force coming from the All Blacks. And here's a clip of the All Blacks teaching the Wallabies a lesson. So you can see that after engage, the Australian middle row and Samo have all come up. And you can see that on this side, Horwell's basically popped up above the front row. Now, whilst that's partially an issue of the front row not keeping low enough, the pack needs to work together. You can see here that when the middle row's up high or the back row's up high, there's nothing the front row can do to counter. And finally, let me talk about the binds between the middle row and the front row. Before engage, this has to be really tight, so shoulders are locked onto the props, so that when we get to the power of the engage, both the front row and the middle row are working together. You can see in the example here that clearly the English lock wasn't bound tightly, because whilst the front row have stopped, you can see the English second rower's head still moving forward. That loose and sloppy contact makes it impossible for the front row and the middle row to work together, and therefore impossible to transfer power and resist what the French are throwing at them. Following on from my two recent videos that talked about the technique of front rows in the scrum and the middle row, today I want to look at some other finer points of scrummaging. First up, the pack working as an 8. Here's a good recent example, where although it's the Hurricanes' feed, the Blues pack work as an 8. They win the hit, they maintain good low body shape, they're all at the same height, driving in the same direction. And then they keep pumping their legs as they drive through over the ball. Eventually they win a turnover. Now to the importance of the back row staying on the scrum with their shoulders in contact and providing drive for as long as they can before they need to disengage to follow the ball. Let's look at an example of the Wallabies back row here. The All Blacks have got a clearly dominant scrum and the Wallabies are going backwards. But very early on, all three of the Wallabies back row have come up off the scrum. They're no longer assisting with the drive, and effectively the Wallaby pack is then working as a 5 rather than an 8. Here's another scrum with the Wallabies against Italy this time, and it's a much better scrum. Partly because the Wallabies flankers stay on the scrum a lot longer, the shoulders are in contact with the props' hips, and they're assisting with the drive. Now, although Samo's not pushing from number 8, I'll show you why that's not such a problem in a moment. To show you more about how the back 5 works in a scrum, it's worthwhile having a look at overhead footage. First, let's look at the angles the props are driving on. Due to the fact that the opposition is offset to your right, the props actually work on different angles. The tight head usually drives quite straight, aiming to drive between the opposition loose head and hooker. On the other side, the loose head aims to get his head under the sternum of the opposition tight head, and therefore he has to drive on an angle from his original starting position. Now, in order to understand how the drive of the middle row is channeled through the prop in the required direction, we first have to remember that both the flanker and the lock only have one shoulder in contact with the prop. So when they're driving forward, it's natural that their drive angles through that shoulder rather than being a straight drive as many people assume. This means that the flanker and the lock are actually pushing in different directions, but when their force meets at the prop, the force goes straight through. So the drive from the flanker is helping to control the drive of the lock. If the flanker's not pushing, the lock's drive will be going in the opposite direction to that required. And this is what makes it critical for the flanker to stay on the scrum and continue driving. Now, the other thing you'll probably notice from these clips is that the locks are actually pushing in different directions. So far from them working together as most people assume, the locks actually work closely with the flanker and the prop in a pod of 3, rather than working together. You'll also see that that means the lock's hips come apart and there's nothing for number 8 to push on. So what is the role of the number 8? Well, when it's your feed, the number 8 will normally be controlling the ball at the back of the scrum. When it's the opposition feed, they'll normally be the first one up, looking to leave the scrum early and chase the ball, as Samo was against Italy. One of the other important roles for a number 8 is that they hold the weight back of the scrum until they hear the engage call from the referee when they drive forward, which initiates their own team's engage. I've slowed this footage down so you can get an idea of how the number 8 initiates the engage, even though in this case they went early. Now, as well as pushing to initiate the engagement in the scrum, the number 8 does have a continuing role to push in the scrum up to the point where the lock's hips typically separate. Due to the offset of the opposition scrum, the opposition have their hooker and loose head in a 2-on-1 against your own tight head. So it's the tight head side that needs as much help as possible from the number 8, and so typically they only push with their right shoulder. Of course, that can vary depending on which way you're trying to wheel the scrum. But the point is that the number 8 doesn't apply pushing pressure on the scrum for that long before they come up to either control the ball or be the first to